I never told my brother-in-law I served 25 years in the military as a senior cyber intelligence officer. He thought I was just his gentle, unmarried sister-in-law living off a meager government pension. Until my sister sent me her secret distress code. 30 minutes later, his billion-dollar empire started to burn. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and tried to break your spirit. My name is Simone and I am 43 years old. The private dining room at the Capital City Club in Buckhead was suffocatingly quiet. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the long, heavy mahogany table. Preston, my 42-year-old brother-in-law, had rented out the entire space to celebrate his latest hedge fund acquisition. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved like ghosts, pouring vintage champagne into our crystal glasses and serving plates of expensive caviar. I sat at the far end of the table nursing a simple cup of black tea. I had just officially retired from the United States Special Operations Command earlier that afternoon. I was wearing my formal dress blues, a subtle but proud nod to a career I had dedicated my entire adult life to. But in this room, my service meant absolutely nothing. The sharp clatter of heavy plastic hitting fine china broke the silence. A premium platinum credit card landed squarely on my empty dinner plate. I slowly looked up. Preston was leaning back in his leather chair, swirling his expensive red wine with an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. "Take that, and buy a decent dress, Simone," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "That old military uniform you insist on wearing is embarrassing my white family. There are highly important investors dining in the very next room, and I cannot have them thinking my wife comes from a line of government charity cases. Go fix yourself before dessert arrives." The absolute disrespect hung in the air, heavy and thick. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the card. I just looked at him with the cold, calculated stare I had perfected over 2 decades of military service. Preston was exactly the kind of man who measured human worth in stock options and exclusive zip codes. He thought my 25 years of service consisted of scrubbing barracks, cleaning toilets, and marching in the mud. I never bothered to correct him. I never mentioned that I was a high-ranking cyber intelligence officer who had designed counter-terrorism firewalls for the Pentagon and tracked international money laundering syndicates. To him, I was just a sad, aging black woman who had failed to secure a rich husband and lived on a pathetic fixed income. I waited patiently for someone to speak up. I looked at my parents sitting proudly at the head of the table. My father, Bishop Sterling, ran one of the largest and most profitable megachurches in all of Atlanta. He built his entire brand on preaching family values, community uplift, and unconditional love. Yet he simply reached for his water glass, took a long sip, and nodded in full agreement with the man insulting his eldest daughter. "Preston is right, Simone," my father said, his booming pastoral voice echoing off the private room walls. Monique knew how to choose a successful white man to elevate this family status. She married into true wealth and power. And look at you. You are 43 years old, sitting here all alone with your cheap little military pension. You should be incredibly grateful Preston is generous enough to offer you a financial handout. My mother, Vivian, gently dabbed the corners of her mouth with a white linen napkin. She wore a massive diamond necklace that Preston had bought her for her birthday last month, a shiny, glittering collar that purchased her absolute loyalty. "You have always been so stubborn and difficult, Simone," she sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "You could have stayed here in Atlanta with us. You could have joined the church administration board and married one of the wealthy deacons. Instead, you ran off to basic training and wasted your best years living in dirty tents. Now look at your younger sister. She is a respected society wife, and you are wearing an old uniform to a 5-star restaurant. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Take his credit card and go make yourself presentable." I shifted my gaze to my younger sister Monique. She was 38 years old, sitting directly across the long table from me. She was wearing a stunning red designer gown that cost more than a car, but she looked incredibly small inside it. Her shoulders were hunched inward. Her eyes were fixed intensely on her untouched plate of seared salmon. She looked pale, exhausted, and completely drained of life. The vibrant, lively, and fiercely independent girl I grew up with had been slowly erased over the last 5 years of her marriage to Preston. She had been replaced by a quiet, perfectly groomed accessory who only spoke when spoken to. I took a deep, steadying breath. I was finally done. I placed my cloth napkin on the table, preparing to stand up and walk out of that toxic room forever. I would leave them to their money and their misery. Just as my hands pressed against the armrests, my phone vibrated intensely against the mahogany wood. The sudden loud buzzing sound made everyone at the table pause. I picked up my phone. It was a message notification in our family group chat. The screen showed it was from Monique. I immediately looked up at her. Her hands were trembling violently under the table, but her face remained completely blank, still staring down at her plate. I looked back down at the glowing screen. The message read, "Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" A freezing cold shiver ran violently down my spine, paralyzing me for a fraction of a second. The fine dining room, the arrogant brother-in-law, the condescending parents, they all completely faded into the background. I was instantly transported back 30 years to a tiny, cramped apartment in a rough, dangerous neighborhood in South Atlanta. This was long before the megachurch money, long before the country club memberships and the designer clothes. When Monique and I were just kids navigating a volatile environment, we created a secret emergency code. We memorized a specific phrase to use if we were ever trapped with a dangerous person or cornered in a life-threatening situation where we could not call the police or speak freely. We swore a blood oath that we would only ever use it if it was an absolute matter of life and death. The code was "Flight lands at 5 p.m. It translated to one simple, terrifying truth: my life is in danger. Save me now. Across the table, Preston casually pulled his phone from his tailored suit jacket. He glanced at the new notification and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He shook his head, typing a quick, thoughtless response into the family chat. My screen lit up again instantly. Preston had replied, "Try Uber." He tossed his phone back onto the table, rolling his eyes at what he assumed was his wife making a stupid typo or sending a message to the wrong group entirely. My parents chuckled along with him, finding her supposed mistake highly amusing. He had absolutely no idea what those words actually meant. He had no idea the gravity of the silent scream his wife had just sent across the table. And more importantly, he had no idea that by sending that mocking reply, he had just signed his own professional and personal death warrant. I looked at the shiny platinum credit card still sitting on my dinner plate. Then I looked at the arrogant man who genuinely thought he owned my sister body and soul. I locked my eyes directly on Preston, maintaining a perfectly blank, lethal expression that I had used in interrogation rooms overseas. I slowly pushed my heavy wooden chair back and stood up, adjusting the crisp collar of my military dress blues. "Sure," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady, cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "I will call an Uber. Just wait right here." I never told my brother-in-law I served 25 years in the military as a senior cyber intelligence officer. He thought I was just his gentle, unmarried sister-in-law, living off a meager government pension. Until my sister sent me her secret distress code. 30 minutes later, his billion-dollar empire started to burn. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and tried to break your spirit. My name is Simone and I am 43 years old. The private dining room at the Capital City Club in Buckhead was suffocatingly quiet. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the long, heavy mahogany table. Preston, my 42-year-old brother-in-law, had rented out the entire space to celebrate his latest hedge fund acquisition. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved like ghosts, pouring vintage champagne into our crystal glasses and serving plates of expensive caviar. I sat at the far end of the table, nursing a simple cup of black tea. I had just officially retired from the United States Special Operations Command earlier that afternoon. I was wearing my formal dress blues, a subtle but proud nod to a career I had dedicated my entire adult life to. But in this room, my service meant absolutely nothing. The sharp clatter of heavy plastic hitting fine china broke the silence. A premium platinum credit card landed squarely on my empty dinner plate. I slowly looked up. Preston was leaning back in his leather chair, swirling his expensive red wine with an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. "Take that and buy a decent dress, Simone," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "That old military uniform you insist on wearing is embarrassing my white family. There are highly important investors dining in the very next room, and I cannot have them thinking my wife comes from a line of government charity cases. Go fix yourself before dessert arrives." The absolute disrespect hung in the air, heavy and thick. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the card. I just looked at him with the cold, calculated stare I had perfected over 2 decades of military service. Preston was exactly the kind of man who measured human worth in stock options and exclusive zip codes. He thought my 25 years of service consisted of scrubbing barracks, cleaning toilets, and marching in the mud. I never bothered to correct him. I never mentioned that I was a high-ranking cyber intelligence officer who had designed counterterrorism firewalls for the Pentagon and tracked international money laundering syndicates. To him, I was just a sad, aging black woman who had failed to secure a rich husband and lived on a pathetic fixed income. I waited patiently for someone to speak up. I looked at my parents sitting proudly at the head of the table. My father, Bishop Sterling, ran one of the largest and most profitable megachurches in all of Atlanta. He built his entire brand on preaching family values, community uplift, and unconditional love. Yet he simply reached for his water glass, took a long sip, and nodded in full agreement with the man insulting his eldest daughter. "Preston is right, Simone," my father said, his booming pastoral voice echoing off the private room walls. Monique knew how to choose a successful white man to elevate this family status. She married into true wealth and power. And look at you. You are 43 years old, sitting here all alone with your cheap little military pension. You should be incredibly grateful Preston is generous enough to offer you a financial handout. My mother, Vivian, gently dabbed the corners of her mouth with a white linen napkin. She wore a massive diamond necklace that Preston had bought her for her birthday last month, a shiny, glittering collar that purchased her absolute loyalty. "You have always been so stubborn and difficult, Simone." She sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "You could have stayed here in Atlanta with us. You could have joined the church administration board and married one of the wealthy deacons. Instead, you ran off to basic training and wasted your best years living in dirty tents. Now look at your younger sister. She is a respected society wife, and you are wearing an old uniform to a 5-star restaurant. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Take his credit card and go make yourself presentable." I shifted my gaze to my younger sister, Monique. She was 38 years old, sitting directly across the long table from me. She was wearing a stunning red designer gown that cost more than a car, but she looked incredibly small inside it. Her shoulders were hunched inward. Her eyes were fixed intensely on her untouched plate of seared salmon. She looked pale, exhausted, and completely drained of life. The vibrant, lively, and fiercely independent girl I grew up with had been slowly erased over the last 5 years of her marriage to Preston. She had been replaced by a quiet, perfectly groomed accessory who only spoke when spoken to. I took a deep, steadying breath. I was finally done. I placed my cloth napkin on the table, preparing to stand up and walk out of that toxic room forever. I would leave them to their money and their misery. Just as my hands pressed against the armrests, my phone vibrated intensely against the mahogany wood. The sudden, loud buzzing sound made everyone at the table pause. I picked up my phone. It was a message notification in our family group chat. The screen showed it was from Monique. I immediately looked up at her. Her hands were trembling violently under the table, but her face remained completely blank, still staring down at her plate. I looked back down at the glowing screen. The message read, "Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" A freezing cold shiver ran violently down my spine, paralyzing me for a fraction of a second. The fine dining room, the arrogant brother-in-law, the condescending parents, they all completely faded into the background. I was instantly transported back 30 years to a tiny cramped apartment in a rough, dangerous neighborhood in South Atlanta. This was long before the megachurch money, long before the country club memberships, and the designer clothes. When Monique and I were just kids, navigating a volatile environment, we created a secret emergency code. We memorized a specific phrase to use if we were ever trapped with a dangerous person or cornered in a life-threatening situation where we could not call the police or speak freely. We swore a blood oath that we would only ever use it if it was an absolute matter of life and death. The code was "Flight lands at 5 p.m. It translated to one simple, terrifying truth: "My life is in danger. Save me now." Across the table, Preston casually pulled his phone from his tailored suit jacket. He glanced at the new notification and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He shook his head, typing a quick, thoughtless response into the family chat. My screen lit up again instantly. Preston had replied, "Try Uber." He tossed his phone back onto the table, rolling his eyes at what he assumed was his wife, making a stupid typo, or sending a message to the wrong group entirely. My parents chuckled along with him, finding her supposed mistake highly amusing. He had absolutely no idea what those words actually meant. He had no idea the gravity of the silent scream his wife had just sent across the table. And more importantly, he had no idea that by sending that mocking reply, he had just signed his own professional and personal death warrant. I looked at the shiny platinum credit card still sitting on my dinner plate. Then I looked at the arrogant man who genuinely thought he owned my sister body and soul. I locked my eyes directly on Preston, maintaining a perfectly blank, lethal expression that I had used in interrogation rooms overseas. I slowly pushed my heavy wooden chair back and stood up, adjusting the crisp collar of my military dress blues. "Sure," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady, cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "I will call an Uber. Just wait right here." I never told my white brother-in-law I served 25 years in the military as a senior cyber intelligence officer. He genuinely thought I was just his gentle, unmarried sister-in-law, living off a meager government pension. He thought I was completely harmless. That was his first catastrophic mistake. His second was underestimating my bond with my sister. He thought he owned her completely, right up until the moment she sent me our secret childhood distress code. 30 minutes later, his billion-dollar empire started to burn. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and tried to break your spirit. My name is Simone, and I am 43 years old. The private dining room at the Capital City Club in Buckhead was suffocatingly quiet. Crystal chandeliers cast a harsh golden glow over the long, heavy mahogany table. Preston, my 42-year-old brother-in-law, had rented out the entire space to celebrate his latest hedge fund acquisition. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved like ghosts, pouring vintage champagne into our crystal glasses and serving plates of expensive caviar. I sat at the far end of the table nursing a simple cup of black tea. I had just officially retired from the United States Special Operations Command earlier that afternoon. I was wearing my formal dress blues, a subtle but proud nod to a career I had dedicated my entire adult life to. But in this room, my service meant absolutely nothing. The sharp clatter of heavy plastic hitting fine china broke the silence. A premium platinum credit card landed squarely on my empty dinner plate. I slowly looked up. Preston was leaning back in his leather chair, swirling his expensive red wine with an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. "Take that and buy a decent dress, Simone," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "That old military uniform you insist on wearing is embarrassing my family. There are highly important investors dining in the very next room, and I cannot have them thinking my wife comes from a line of government charity cases. Go fix yourself before dessert arrives." The absolute disrespect hung in the air, heavy and thick. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the card. I just looked at him with the cold, calculated stare I had perfected over 2 decades in interrogation rooms. Preston was exactly the kind of man who measured human worth in stock options and exclusive zip codes. He liked to play the role of the generous white savior who had elevated a black family out of their ordinary lives. He thought my 25 years of service consisted of scrubbing barracks, cleaning toilets, and marching in the mud. I never bothered to correct him. I never mentioned that I was a high-ranking cyber intelligence officer who had designed counterterrorism firewalls for the Pentagon and tracked international money laundering syndicates across the dark web. To him, I was just a sad, aging black woman who had failed to secure a rich husband and lived on a pathetic fixed income. I waited patiently for someone to speak up. I looked at my parents sitting proudly at the head of the table. My father, Bishop Sterling, ran one of the largest and most profitable megachurches in all of Atlanta. He built his entire brand on preaching family values, community uplift, and unconditional love. Yet he had gladly traded those values for front-row seats at political galas and a fleet of luxury cars funded by his wealthy son-in-law. He simply reached for his water glass, took a long sip, and nodded in full agreement with the man insulting his eldest daughter. "Preston is right, Simone," my father said, his booming pastoral voice echoing off the private room walls. "Monique knew how to choose a successful, brilliant man to elevate this family status. She married into true wealth and power. And look at you. You are 43 years old, sitting here all alone with your cheap little military pension. You should be incredibly grateful Preston is generous enough to offer you a financial handout. Stop being so prideful and take the money." My mother, Vivian, gently dabbed the corners of her mouth with a white linen napkin. She wore a massive diamond necklace that Preston had bought her for her birthday last month, a shiny, glittering collar that purchased her absolute loyalty. "You have always been so stubborn and difficult, Simone," she sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "You could have stayed here in Atlanta with us. You could have joined the church administration board and married one of the wealthy deacons. Instead, you ran off to basic training and wasted your best years living in dirty tents with a bunch of rough men. Now look at your younger sister. She is a respected society wife, and you are wearing an old stiff uniform to a 5-star restaurant. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Take his credit card and go make yourself presentable before the guests arrive." I shifted my gaze to my younger sister, Monique. She was 38 years old, sitting directly across the long table from me. She was wearing a stunning red designer gown that cost more than a luxury car, but she looked incredibly small inside it. Her shoulders were hunched inward. Her eyes were fixed intensely on her untouched plate of seared salmon. She looked pale, exhausted, and completely drained of life. The vibrant, lively, and fiercely independent girl I grew up with had been slowly erased over the last 5 years of her marriage to Preston. She had been replaced by a quiet, perfectly groomed accessory who only spoke when spoken to. I noticed a faint shadow of makeup near her jawline, a desperate attempt to cover what looked like a fresh bruise. My training kicked in immediately, analyzing her rigid posture, her shallow breathing, and the sheer terror radiating from her silence. I took a deep, steadying breath. I was finally done. I placed my cloth napkin on the table, preparing to stand up and walk out of that toxic room forever. I would leave them to their money and their misery. Just as my hands pressed against the armrests, my phone vibrated intensely against the mahogany wood. The sudden loud buzzing sound made everyone at the table pause. I picked up my phone. It was a message notification in our family group chat. The screen showed it was from Monique. I immediately looked up at her. Her hands were trembling violently under the table, but her face remained completely blank, still staring down at her plate. I looked back down at the glowing screen. The message read, "Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" A freezing cold shiver ran violently down my spine, paralyzing me for a fraction of a second. The fine dining room, the arrogant brother-in-law, the condescending parents, they all completely faded into the background. I was instantly transported back 30 years to a tiny, cramped apartment in a rough, dangerous neighborhood in South Atlanta. This was long before the megachurch money, long before the country club memberships and the designer clothes. When Monique and I were just kids navigating a volatile environment, we created a secret emergency code. We memorized a specific phrase to use if we were ever trapped with a dangerous person or cornered in a life-threatening situation where we could not call the police or speak freely. We swore a blood oath that we would only ever use it if it was an absolute matter of life and death. The code was flight lands at 5 p.m. It translated to one simple, terrifying truth: my life is in immediate danger. Save me now. Across the table, Preston casually pulled his phone from his tailored suit jacket. He glanced at the new notification and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He shook his head, typing a quick, thoughtless response into the family chat. My screen lit up again instantly. Preston had replied, "Try Uber." He tossed his phone back onto the table, rolling his eyes at what he assumed was his wife making a stupid typo or sending a message to the wrong group entirely. My parents chuckled along with him, finding her supposed mistake highly amusing. He had absolutely no idea what those words actually meant. He had no idea the gravity of the silent scream his wife had just sent across the table. And more importantly, he had no idea that by sending that mocking reply, he had just signed his own professional and personal death warrant. I looked at the shiny platinum credit card still sitting on my dinner plate. Then I looked at the arrogant man who genuinely thought he owned my sister body and soul. I locked my eyes directly on Preston, maintaining a perfectly blank, lethal expression that I had used in interrogation rooms overseas. I slowly pushed my heavy wooden chair back and stood up, adjusting the crisp collar of my military dress blues. "Sure," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady, cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "I will call an Uber. Just wait right here." The glowing lines of encrypted code reflected off my face in the darkened room, painting the walls of my hidden home office in a cool, calculating blue. Preston thought freezing my bank accounts earlier that morning would leave me paralyzed. He genuinely believed that using his connections at the bank to cut off my pension and drain Monique's emergency funds would force me to crawl back to his mansion and beg for mercy on my knees. He thought I was just a retired soldier who spent her days polishing combat boots and answering phones. He had absolutely no idea he was dealing with the primary architect of the Pentagon's internal security firewall. It took me less than 40 minutes to shatter his personal servers. I did not just bypass his security. I completely dismantled it, leaving no digital fingerprints behind. As I dug through his private servers, I found the corporate shell companies he was using to quietly steal the African American heritage lands my father's church managed. The file was arrogantly named Legacy Transfer. He was buying out generational properties for pennies on the dollar and transferring the deeds to offshore accounts. But as I kept digging, I found a secondary, highly secured email account. And what I found inside was not just corporate greed. It was a weapon I could use to tear his life apart from the inside out. Preston was having an affair. Her name was Chloe, a 32-year-old white project manager at a rival commercial development firm. I printed the entire dossier, grabbed my coat, and picked up Monique from the safe house I had tucked her into the night before. I did not tell her where we were going until I pulled my car up to the valet stand at Les Bilboquets, one of the most exclusive and pretentious French restaurants in the Buckhead district. Monique trembled in the passenger seat, her eyes wide with deep fear as she spotted Preston's custom silver Porsche parked directly near the front entrance. I reached over and unbuckled her seatbelt. "We are not hiding anymore," I told her, my voice leaving no room for argument. "You are a Sterling, and today you are going to watch his world burn." We walked past the hostess, completely ignoring her frantic protests about reservations, and moved straight through the crowded, sunlit dining room. The air was thick with the smell of truffles and expensive perfume. Preston was sitting at a prime corner table holding Chloe's hand across the crisp white linen tablecloth. He was leaning in close, whispering something that made her throw her head back and giggle. He looked up, his smug smile instantly dropping into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock as Monique and I approached. Before he could utter a single word to defend himself, I slammed a thick, heavy manila folder directly onto the table, deliberately knocking over his crystal water glass. Chloe gasped loudly, pulling her hand back as the ice water soaked rapidly into the pristine tablecloth and dripped onto Preston's expensive trousers. Preston's face turned a dangerous mottled shade of red. "Simone, what the hell do you think you are doing here?" he hissed, keeping his voice low but filled with venom as he glanced nervously at the surrounding tables. "You and this hysterical woman need to leave right now before I call security and have you both thrown out on the street." I completely ignored his pathetic threat and looked directly at his mistress. Chloe was staring at Monique, clearly recognizing the bruised and exhausted wife of the man she was sleeping with. "Chloe," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm, steady, and loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "My brother-in-law here is very good at making promises he never intends to keep. But sleeping with a married man is the absolute least of your problems today. I highly suggest you open that folder." Preston lunged across the table to grab the folder, but my military reflexes were a fraction of a second faster. I snatched it up and dropped it directly into Chloe's lap out of his reach. She opened it with shaking hands. The color completely drained from her face as her eyes darted across the highlighted legal documents and banking transfer records I had printed. "These are bank records and property deeds," I explained, my tone surgical and precise. "Preston did not just shower you with expensive dinners and empty promises of leaving his wife. He tricked you into signing a secondary mortgage on your own home. He used your signature as a blind guarantor to cover $3.5 million in bad debts from his failing hedge fund. If his company goes under, which I promise you, it will very shortly, the bank seizes your house. You are entirely on the hook for his financial crimes." Chloe looked up at Preston, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and profound betrayal. "Preston, is this true?" she demanded, her voice cracking as she held up a document bearing her forged signature. "Did you use my house to secure your fund?" Preston scrambled frantically to compose himself, his charming, powerful facade completely shattered into a million pieces. "Chloe, baby, do not listen to this crazy woman," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "It is just a temporary transfer of collateral assets. I was going to move the funds back next quarter. You know I would never put you in danger." "You lied to me!" Chloe shouted, standing up so fast her heavy wooden chair crashed backward onto the floor. "You said those papers were a standard non-disclosure agreement for the new commercial project. You set me up to take the fall for your massive debt." The restaurant was now in absolute chaos. Waiters were frozen in place holding trays of expensive food. Wealthy patrons were whispering, pointing, and recording the scene on their phones. And right on cue, the heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open. My father, Bishop Sterling, stormed into the dining room. Preston must have texted him the exact moment he saw us walk through the front doors, calling his most loyal puppet to come handle the situation. My father's face was contorted with absolute fury. He marched straight toward our table, his expensive tailored suit practically vibrating with rage. He completely ignored the fact that his son-in-law was sitting at a romantic lunch with a mistress. He ignored his youngest daughter, Monique, who was standing there with a visible bruise on her jaw from her husband's abuse. His only focus was the disruption of his financial pipeline. "Simone," he roared, his booming pastoral voice silencing the entire dining room. "What in God's name are you doing? Are you completely out of your mind?" I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, meeting his furious gaze without a single ounce of fear. "I am cleaning up the disgusting mess you refuse to handle," I replied coldly. My father's eyes blazed with a toxic mixture of embarrassment and rage. He saw me not as a daughter protecting her sister, but as a direct threat to his entire empire. "Preston is a benefactor of this family," he spat, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly in my face. "He has poured millions of dollars into the church funds. He elevated our family name in this city. And you come in here dressed like a street thug, causing a scene and trying to destroy my entire empire. You have always been a massive disappointment. You are a disgrace to the Sterling name." He raised his right hand, pulling it back to deliver a vicious, open-handed slap across my face. It was the exact same heavy hand he had used to strike fear into me when I was a defenseless child. He thought I would cower. He thought I would bow my head and accept his physical punishment just like I did 30 years ago. But I was no longer a frightened little girl in a South Atlanta project. I was a highly trained special operations veteran. Before his hand could even begin its violent descent, my muscle memory took over completely. In a fraction of a second, I stepped effortlessly inside his guard. I grabbed his raised wrist with my left hand, pivoted my hips to leverage his own body weight against him, and locked his arm aggressively behind his back. The close-quarters combat movement was so fast, so utterly precise, that he did not even have time to register what had happened until he was bent completely over the white linen dining table. He gasped loudly in sudden pain as I applied the exact amount of upward pressure needed to totally immobilize him without snapping his shoulder out of its socket. The entire restaurant gasped in collective shock. Preston took a terrified step back, his eyes darting toward the exit. Chloe stood paralyzed, clutching the folder of her ruined finances to her chest. Monique simply covered her mouth, her eyes wide with a newfound realization of her sister's true strength. I leaned in close to my father's ear, making absolutely sure only he could hear the lethal venom in my voice. "You are not protecting your daughter," I whispered coldly, applying just a fraction more pressure to his trapped arm to ensure he understood my absolute dominance in this situation. "You are protecting your wallet. You sold Monique to a monster just so you could sit in the VIP section of life and pretend you are a righteous man. You are a pathetic excuse for a father and an absolute disgrace of a pastor. And I promise you right now, I'm going to smash that wallet to pieces." I released his arm with a swift, calculated shove, sending him stumbling forward against the table and knocking over a bottle of wine. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket, turned to my sister, and offered her my hand. Monique took it, her head held higher than I had seen in 5 long years. We walked out of the restaurant together in perfect unison, the sharp clicks of our shoes echoing in the stunned silence of the dining room. We left the three of them drowning in the very public, humiliating wreckage of their own making. The financial war had officially begun, and they had absolutely no idea how hopelessly outmatched they truly were. Less than 24 hours later, the atmosphere inside the downtown high-rise of Preston Elite Legal Team felt intentionally designed to suffocate. The architecture of the 65th floor conference room was entirely asymmetrical, featuring slanted glass walls and sharp, jagged angles that made the entire world outside look violently tilted. It was a psychological tactic meant to disorient and intimidate anyone sitting on the opposite side of the heavy marble table. Monique sat alone in the center of the room, looking incredibly fragile. Across from her sat Preston, flanked by 3 of the most expensive and ruthless corporate defense attorneys in the state of Georgia. Preston looked entirely unfazed by the public humiliation he had suffered at the restaurant the day before. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, and his arrogant demeanor had returned with full force. He slid a thick, legally binding document across the cold marble surface toward my sister. Next to the document, he placed a silver pen. "It is a very simple arrangement, Monique," he said, his voice echoing with a sickeningly sweet tone. "You are going to sign this confession. It clearly states that you have been suffering from severe clinical depression, and in a state of diminished mental capacity, you initiated a series of unauthorized financial transfers. It says you embezzled the funds from the African American Heritage Land Trust, using my network access without my knowledge." Monique stared at the paper, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. "You want me to take the fall for your theft?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "You want me to go to federal prison for stealing from my own community?" Preston leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I want you to take responsibility for your erratic behavior," he corrected smoothly. "My legal team has already drafted the medical evaluations. If you sign this taking the full blame, my attorneys will negotiate a plea deal. You will get a slap on the wrist, maybe some probation and mandatory psychiatric counseling. But if you refuse to sign it, I will unleash hell. I will have you arrested for the theft before lunchtime. And more importantly, I will ensure you never see your son again." Monique flinched as if she had been physically struck. Preston smiled, knowing he had hit the ultimate nerve. He had already locked her out of the estate and instructed his private security to keep her away from their 5-year-old son. Sign the paper, Monique, and you can go back to the house and pack your things, he said, leaning back in his chair with absolute victory radiating from his pores. Sign it, and I will let you hold your boy. Refuse, and I will use my wealth to tie you up in family court until he forgets what your face looks like. One of the elite lawyers tapped the document impatiently. We suggest you listen to your husband, Mrs. Sterling. This is the most generous offer you are going to receive. Monique slowly reached for the silver pen. Her hand was shaking so violently she could barely grip the metal. Tears streamed silently down her face as the immense weight of the room pressed down on her, breaking her spirit. The heavy frosted glass doors of the conference room swung open with a sharp click. I walked into the room wearing a tailored charcoal civilian suit, my posture perfectly straight. Walking right beside me was an older white gentleman. He looked entirely out of place in this room of million-dollar sharks. He wore a faded brown tweed jacket that was frayed at the elbows, slightly scuffed shoes, and wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a battered old leather briefcase and walked with a slight limp. Preston let out a loud, dramatic sigh of annoyance. "Simone, you are trespassing," he snapped. "This is a private legal mediation. Security should have never let you up here. And who on earth is this elderly gentleman you dragged in from the street? Is this your legal representation? Is this the best lawyer your pathetic military pension could afford?" The three corporate attorneys chuckled, exchanging amused glances at the older man's modest appearance. I completely ignored Preston and pulled out a chair next to my sister. The older gentleman quietly took the seat on the other side of Monique, placing his battered leather briefcase gently on the marble table. He did not say a word. He simply folded his hands and looked pleasantly at the men across the table. "Do not sign anything yet, Monique," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Let me read what this coward is trying to force on you." Preston laughed, leaning back and crossing his arms. "Read it all you want, Simone. It changes absolutely nothing. Your sister committed massive financial fraud, and I am generously offering her a way out that keeps her out of a federal penitentiary. It is an ironclad confession. She takes the blame for the illegal land transfers, and in exchange she gets supervised visitation with her son. It is a brilliant deal." I picked up the document and scanned the pages rapidly. My eyes darted over the legal jargon, the clauses, and the specific stipulations. The document explicitly stated that Monique acted entirely alone, utilizing Preston's personal computer without his consent to funnel millions of dollars into offshore accounts. It was a masterpiece of legal framing designed to completely shield Preston from the FBI investigation that was inevitably coming. I set the document back down on the table. The room was dead silent, waiting for my reaction. I looked at Monique and gave her a small, reassuring nod. "Sign it," I said clearly. Monique whipped her head toward me, her eyes wide with absolute horror. "Simone, what are you saying?" she gasped. "It is a lie. He stole that land. He stole that money. If I sign this, I'm admitting to a federal crime." I placed my hand gently over hers. "I know what it says, Monique. Trust me. Pick up the pen and sign your name exactly where they asked you to." Preston burst into laughter, clapping his hands together. "Well, I have to admit, I am genuinely surprised, Simone. I thought you would put up more of a fight. But it seems even a stubborn military grunt like you knows when she is hopelessly outgunned. You finally realize you cannot win against real power. Good advice. Sign the paper, Monique." Monique looked deep into my eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation. Seeing only absolute certainty, she took a shaky breath, gripped the silver pen, and signed her name on the bottom line. Preston practically snatched the document from the table the moment the ink was dry. He flipped to the final page, clicking his own expensive pen. He quickly signed his name on the attestation line legally, verifying as a witness and victim that the confession was entirely accurate and true. He slid the signed document toward his lead attorney with a triumphant grin. "Make sure that gets filed immediately," Preston ordered his lawyer. Then he looked at Monique with cold, dead eyes. "You can go see your son for 1 hour today under the supervision of my guards. Then I want you off my property." I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen once, unlocking it. Then I turned my attention to the quiet, older gentleman sitting next to my sister. Are we ready? I asked him calmly. The older man smiled warmly. He popped the latches on his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a single plain manila folder. He slid it precisely across the marble table, stopping it exactly in front of Preston. Preston frowned, looking down at the folder. "What is this garbage?" he demanded. The older gentleman cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He spoke with a quiet, gravelly voice that commanded the kind of absolute authority that cannot be bought. "My name is General Marcus Vance," he said calmly. "United States Army Cyber Command retired. I served with your sister-in-law in a theater of operations you could not possibly comprehend. She saved my life and the lives of my entire unit. I owe her a debt that can never be fully repaid. But today I am doing my absolute best to try." The arrogant smirks on the faces of the corporate lawyers instantly vanished. They sat up straighter, suddenly realizing the gravity of the man sitting across from them. Preston stared at the general, his face suddenly paling. "I strongly suggest you open that folder," General Vance instructed, his tone polite, but chillingly firm. Preston hesitated, then flipped the folder open. Inside were stacks of highly complex data sheets, routing numbers, and thousands of lines of encrypted server code translated into undeniable plain text. "What is this?" Preston stammered, his voice losing all its previous bravado. I rested my elbows on the table, leaning forward so Preston had nowhere to look but directly into my eyes. "Those are the unedited raw IP logs from your heavily encrypted personal servers," I explained, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You see, Preston, when you locked my bank accounts yesterday, you left a digital backdoor wide open. You assumed I was just a grunt. You had no idea I was the primary architect of the counterintelligence firewall for the Department of Defense. I did not just hack your emails. I mirrored your entire hard drive." Preston swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically over the pages. "Every single illegal land transfer, every stolen deed, every offshore wire you made to those shell companies is detailed right there," I continued relentlessly. "And the beautiful thing about military-grade tracking algorithms is that they do not just track the money, they track the exact biometric footprint of the user. Those logs prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that every single transaction was executed from your personal laptop utilizing your specific fingerprint scanner from the IP address located exclusively inside your locked home office. A room Monique does not even have the security code to enter." The lead corporate defense attorney reached over and pulled the data sheets toward him. As he read the technical breakdown, the blood completely drained from his face. He slowly pushed his chair back, physically distancing himself from Preston. "You just made the biggest mistake of your entire pathetic life," I told Preston, a cold smile finally touching my lips. "You just signed a sworn legal affidavit declaring that Monique committed those crimes. You verified it under oath. Thank you for that. Because you did not just give us a confession to the theft. You just provided undeniable proof of felony perjury and obstruction of justice." Preston jumped up from his chair, knocking it backward. "You cannot use this!" he shouted, panic lacing his voice. "This was obtained illegally. It is inadmissible. No court will ever accept hacked data." General Vance chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You clearly do not understand how this works, son," the general said, leaning forward. "I still hold top-secret security clearance. I still sit on the advisory board for federal cyber crimes, and I happen to have a direct secure line to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They do not need a warrant when a concerned citizen provides them with a roadmap to a $30 million domestic fraud syndicate." I tapped the screen of my phone one final time and locked it, setting it face down on the marble table. "I just pressed send," I announced, watching Preston's entire world absolutely shatter. "Your sworn perjured confession, along with the complete unedited IP logs, are sitting in the inbox of the Federal Financial Crimes Unit right now. They already have the proof, and by the time you leave this building, they will have the arrest warrants." The arrest warrants would take exactly 12 hours to process through the federal system. I knew this because I had written the interagency protocol myself 5 years ago. Preston knew he had a narrow window, and cornered animals always make desperate, fatal mistakes. I had already moved Monique and my nephew to a secure, off-the-grid location, heavily guarded by two of my former squad mates. I returned to my townhouse alone. I did not lock the doors. I did not arm the commercial security system. I simply brewed a fresh cup of chamomile tea, sat in the center of my darkened living room, and waited for Preston to make his move. At exactly 2 in the morning, the silent alarm on my encrypted tablet pulsed with a brilliant crimson light. I did not flinch. I took a slow, methodical sip of my tea and watched the thermal imaging feed map out my front lawn. 3 distinct heat signatures were moving aggressively through the heavy Atlanta rain approaching my front porch. They were massive men moving with the clumsy, heavy-footed arrogance of hired street muscle. The thermal feed highlighted the distinct, rigid shapes of suppressed firearms tucked against their chests. Preston had realized that corporate lawyers and legal threats were utterly useless against me. So he had resorted to the ultimate coward's tactic. He sent armed thugs in the dead of night to violently extract the physical hard drives from my home, assuming a retired middle-aged woman living alone would be an incredibly easy target. He thought I spent my 25 years in the military sitting behind a safe, comfortable desk. He had no idea that before I engineered firewalls for the Pentagon, I spent a decade running black operations in environments where a single sound meant absolute death. I set my teacup down on the glass table without making a single sound. I tapped a single command into my tablet. Instantly, the primary power grid to my entire property severed. Every light, every digital clock, every street lamp within a 50-foot radius of my home went pitch black. The smart blinds slammed shut and magnetically locked. My home was plunged into a suffocating, impenetrable darkness. The sound of shattered glass echoed from the kitchen. They had bypassed the unlocked front door, opting to break the back window to maintain the element of surprise. It was an amateur, noisy mistake. I slipped off my shoes, letting my bare feet connect quietly with the cool hardwood floor. My breathing slowed, my heart rate dropping to a steady, rhythmic beat. I did not reach for the loaded sidearm secured in my desk drawer. I did not need a gun. A firearm was loud, messy, and entirely impersonal. I wanted to send Preston a very specific, terrifying message about exactly who he was dealing with. I melted into the heavy shadows of the hallway, becoming completely invisible in the environment I had designed. The first intruder stepped through the kitchen archway. He was sweeping a tactical flashlight back and forth, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness in erratic, panicked motions. He was breathing heavily, his boots squeaking against the floorboards. He stepped directly past the decorative column where I was waiting. I moved like water. In one fluid, devastating motion, I stepped into his blind spot, wrapped my left arm tightly around his throat, and clamped my right hand over his mouth to muffle his scream. I drove my knee sharply into the back of his leg, buckling his stance instantly. Before he could even raise his weapon, I applied a precise, localized pressure to his carotid artery. He thrashed violently for exactly 4 seconds before his eyes rolled back and his body went entirely limp. I lowered his 200-pound frame silently to the floor, stripped the weapon from his hands, and tossed it under the kitchen island. 1 down. The second man was moving down the main corridor, his weapon raised, clearly agitated by the sudden loss of communication with his partner. He hugged the right wall, completely unaware that the massive antique mirror at the end of the hall was giving me a perfect view of his approach. I crouched low, waiting until he passed the threshold of the guest bedroom. As his foot hit the floor, I lunged forward from the darkness. I grabbed his extended gun barrel, twisting it violently upward and out of his grip with a sickening crack that snapped his trigger finger. He opened his mouth to scream, but I drove the palm of my hand upward into his chin, snapping his head back and disorienting him completely. I spun around, grabbing him by the collar of his tactical vest, and threw his massive weight forward. He crashed face first into the solid oak doorframe. He dropped like a stone, completely unconscious before he even hit the ground. 2 down. The entire sequence had taken less than 90 seconds. The third man, the leader of this pathetic hit squad, was standing in the center of my living room. He had heard the heavy thud of his partner hitting the doorframe. He was spinning in wild circles, his gun raised, his breathing jagged and loud in the silent house. He was terrified. He realized he was not hunting a helpless civilian. He was being hunted by an apex predator. "Show yourself!" he yelled, his voice cracking with fear as he aimed his weapon into the black void of the hallway. I stepped out of the shadows, standing perfectly still in the faint moonlight filtering through the skylight. He saw my silhouette and immediately raised his gun to fire. He was fast, but he was incredibly sloppy. I closed the distance between us before his finger could even squeeze the trigger. I dropped low, sweeping my right leg out in a brutal arc that completely shattered his center of gravity. His legs flew out from under him, and he crashed hard onto his back, the breath exploding from his lungs. The gun clattered uselessly across the room. Before he could recover, I was on top of him. I grabbed his right arm, twisting it forcefully behind his back, into an agonizing joint lock that threatened to snap his shoulder instantly. I pressed my knee heavily into the center of his spine, pinning him face down against my custom-woven cream-colored rug. He let out a muffled groan of absolute agony, entirely immobilized. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a heavy-duty zip tie, and secured his wrists tightly together. I patted down his jacket and pulled his glowing smartphone from his pocket. I grabbed him by the hair, yanking his head up just enough to force the facial recognition scanner to unlock the device. I scrolled through his recent calls. At the very top of the list was a number saved simply as P. I tapped the number, put the phone on speaker, and set it on the floor right next to the thug's ear. It rang twice before Preston answered. "Do you have the drives?" Preston demanded, his voice breathless with desperate anxiety. "Tell me you burned the place to the ground." I pressed my knee just a fraction of an inch deeper into the thug's spine. The massive man let out a pathetic, whimpering groan of pain that echoed clearly through the phone's microphone. The line went dead silent. I leaned down close to the phone, keeping my voice smooth, calm, and utterly chilling. "Send someone better, Preston," I said, allowing the absolute dominance of the moment to radiate through the speaker. These guys were pathetic. And frankly, they ruined my favorite rug. I could hear Preston's ragged, terrified breathing on the other end of the line. He could not form a single word. His ultimate display of physical intimidation had been dismantled in absolute silence in less than 2 minutes. "Oh, and by the way," I continued, my tone shifting to a pleasant conversational pitch, "I know all about your massive fundraising gala tomorrow night. The one where you plan to steal millions of dollars in front of the entire city. I highly recommend you wear your best suit, Preston. It is going to be an unforgettable evening." I reached down and ended the call, leaving Preston completely trapped in a nightmare of his own creation. The financial war had escalated, and I was about to rip his stolen empire to the ground in front of a live audience. I left the 3 unconscious men bound tightly on the floor of my living room. My former squad mates, who had been quietly securing the exterior perimeter of my property, arrived within minutes to handle the cleanup. I did not ask where they were taking the men, and I did not care. My focus was entirely on the heavy titanium-encased hard drive I had pulled from the tactical vest of the squad leader. Preston was an arrogant man, but his paranoia was his true defining trait. He had sent his hired muscle to physically destroy my network, but he had armed them with his own master offline drive to bypass any localized security protocols. It was a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. Back at the secure safe house, the only illumination in the room came from the cold, sterile glow of my multiple computer monitors and a single desk lamp angled toward the wall. I slowly panned my gaze across the massive corkboard I had erected. It was a chaotic, suffocating web of red string, printed banking records, property deeds, and surveillance photographs. The web connected Preston to offshore shell companies, corrupt local politicians, and anonymous foreign investors. But the very center of the board, the institutional anchor that made the entire fraud possible, was still terrifyingly blank. I plugged the titanium drive into my isolated air-gapped decryption terminal. It took my military-grade algorithms exactly 47 minutes to brute force Preston's biometric encryption lock. When the progress bar finally hit 100%, his master offline ledger opened on my screen. I began rapidly cross-referencing the newly decrypted files with the African American heritage land deeds I had uncovered earlier. The legacy transfer folder was far more extensive and far more sinister than I had initially realized. Preston was not just targeting random, undervalued commercial properties. He was systematically acquiring generational family homes, historic Black-owned businesses, and vital community centers located in the rapidly gentrifying districts of South Atlanta. But what made my blood run entirely cold was the authorization mechanism. Preston could not have legally acquired these highly protected legacy properties without an inside institutional partner vouching for the sales. I opened a heavily encrypted subfolder marked Sterling Trust, and the final devastating piece of the puzzle violently clicked into place. I stared blankly at the high-resolution scans of signed contracts, private email exchanges, and offshore wire transfer receipts. Bishop Sterling, my own father, had not been tricked or manipulated by a savvy businessman. My mother, Vivian, had not been a naive bystander blinded by the glimmer of expensive jewelry. They were active, willing, and calculating conspirators. My father had used his position as the most trusted spiritual leader in the community to convince elderly, vulnerable congregation members to sign over their property rights to the church's holding trust, claiming it was for community preservation and urban renewal. The moment the ink was dry on those documents, he transferred the trusts directly to Preston's anonymous shell companies for pennies on the dollar. In exchange for selling out his own flock, Preston had guaranteed my father a highly coveted, immensely powerful seat on the Atlanta City Council. He had also wired millions of dollars in untraceable funds into a hidden account in the Cayman Islands. I found emails from my mother attached directly to the wire transfers. While her community was being displaced, she was casually discussing the architectural blueprints for a sprawling new luxury estate in the Hamptons, paid for entirely with the stolen inheritance of our people. The soft creak of the safe house door opening broke my intense concentration. Monique stepped tentatively into the room, clutching a steaming cup of tea in her trembling hands. She looked profoundly exhausted. The faint, fading purple bruising along her jawline was a sickening physical reminder of the price she had paid for our family's insatiable greed. She noticed the deadly, rigid stillness in my posture and walked slowly toward the glow of the monitors. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I did not want to show her. For a fraction of a second, every protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to bury this specific file, to permanently delete it, and protect her from the ultimate soul-crushing betrayal. But Monique had lived her entire adult life trapped in a suffocating prison of carefully constructed lies. She deserved the absolute, unvarnished truth. I stepped aside and pointed to the primary monitor displaying a legal contract bearing our father's signature right alongside Preston's. "They knew, Monique," I said, my voice heavy with a profound, aching sorrow. "Preston did not fool them. They sold the community lands together. And worse, they sold you." Monique's eyes darted frantically across the digital documents. She read the emails between Preston and our mother. She looked at the offshore routing numbers. She saw the dates on the transfers. "They knew he was hitting me," she whispered, her voice fracturing as she stared at an email dated 3 years ago. "I went to Mom. I showed her the bruises on my arms. She told me to pray on it. She told me I needed to be a more accommodating wife." A single heavy tear tracked down her pale cheek as the full reality of her existence crashed down upon her. She knew he was a monster. Monique choked out her breathing, becoming ragged and shallow, and she told me to stay because he was funding her new mansion. The porcelain teacup slipped from her numb fingers. It shattered violently against the hardwood floor, sending warm liquid splashing over our shoes. Her knees buckled beneath her. I caught her before she hit the ground, lowering us both carefully to the floor amid the broken porcelain. She buried her face into my shoulder and let out a guttural, agonizing scream of pure heartbreak. It was the devastating sound of a daughter realizing her entire life. Her marriage and her daily suffering had been nothing more than a calculated financial transaction to the people who were supposed to love her most. I let her cry until there were absolutely no tears left. I held her tight, fiercely shielding her, running my hand over her hair, exactly like I did when we were terrified little girls hiding from the chaos of the world. When her sobs finally subsided into exhausted, shallow hiccups, I gently placed my hands on her shoulders. I lifted her chin, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. My expression was forged in absolute unyielding steel. "Listen to me," I said fiercely, my voice vibrating with lethal intent. "When we were kids, living in the projects with nothing but the clothes on our backs and a secret distress code, we survived because we protected each other. We built a fortress out of absolutely nothing. Today, we are going to do the exact same thing right in the middle of their corrupt elite world. They thought you were acceptable collateral damage. They are about to find out you are the detonator." Monique wiped her face. Slowly, a new, unfamiliar hardness settled deeply into her features. The terrified victim was gone, replaced by a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. She looked at the shattered teacup on the floor, and then looked back up at the glowing monitors. "What is the next move?" she asked, her voice stripped of all its previous fragility. I stood up, turned back to the master ledger, and tapped a highlighted transaction heavily flagged for the following evening. "Preston is panicking," I explained, pulling up a highly detailed digital blueprint of an opulent hotel ballroom. "He knows the FBI is currently reviewing the server logs I sent them. He knows his domestic corporate accounts are hours away from being frozen by the federal government. Tomorrow night is his massive, highly publicized annual charity gala. But it is not a fundraiser, Monique. It is a desperate smokescreen." I zoomed in on a secure VIP suite located directly above the ballroom floor. "He is planning to use the church's tax-exempt routing numbers to rapidly launder $50 million and funnel it into an untraceable offshore crypto account right in the middle of the party. He is going to cash out and run." I pulled up the official guest list and the private security protocols for the gala. My father was prominently slated to give the keynote opening blessing. My mother was proudly hosting the silent auction in the main foyer. Preston was going to smile for the cameras, shake hands with the mayor, and play the generous philanthropist while quietly draining the last of the stolen funds from an offline terminal hidden in the VIP suite above them. "We are going to that gala," I told my sister, pulling a sleek military-grade decryption drive from my jacket pocket. "We are going to walk right through the front doors, crash their perfect high society party, and bleed his hidden accounts completely dry in front of every single person they have ever lied to." Looking directly over Monique's tense bare shoulder, the suffocating opulence of the grand ballroom stretched out like a gilded cage. The annual charity gala was in full swing, a masterpiece of high society theater. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, fractured light across the sea of tailored tuxedos and glittering designer gowns. Waiters glided silently through the crowd carrying silver trays of vintage champagne, while a string quartet played a lively symphony that entirely masked the sinister reality of the evening. Every single person in this room was a pawn. They were wealthy, influential props gathered here to applaud Preston while he used the cover of their charitable donations to quietly funnel $50 million out of the country. I stood completely hidden in the dense shadows of the second-floor mezzanine, watching the ballroom floor through the scope of a specialized optical scanner. My comms unit was synced directly to the microscopic earpiece, hidden beneath Monique's carefully styled hair. I tracked her movement as she navigated the crowded floor. She was wearing a stunning emerald green evening gown that flowed flawlessly as she walked, but I could see the rigid terror locking her spine. "Breathe, Monique," I murmured into the microphone, my voice a calm, steady anchor in her ear. "You are a ghost. You are nothing but an obedient, broken shadow. Let his massive ego do all the heavy lifting. Just get the print and get out." Preston was holding court near the center of the room, standing directly beneath the largest chandelier. He was flanked by the mayor, 2 city councilmen, and my father, Bishop Sterling. My father was loudly preaching the virtues of corporate generosity, completely ignoring the fact that the very community he swore to protect was being sold off to fund the champagne flowing into his glass. Preston looked incredibly smug. He wore a custom velvet dinner jacket and smiled for the flashing cameras of the local press, playing the role of the city's most benevolent savior to absolute perfection. Monique approached the group, keeping her head bowed slightly. She had to play the role of the repentant, defeated wife crawling back to her master. Her right hand was tucked carefully against the side of her gown. Pressed firmly against her palm was a transparent military-grade biometric polymer tape. Preston had locked the offshore transfer terminal in the VIP suite upstairs with a physical fingerprint scanner. We could not hack it remotely. We needed his actual physical thumbprint to drain his accounts. When Preston saw Monique approaching, his charming smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes flashing with a sharp, dangerous warning. But the local press was watching. The mayor was watching. Preston instantly adjusted his mask, stepping forward and wrapping a heavy, possessive arm tightly around Monique's waist. He pulled her flush against his side, his fingers digging painfully into her ribs. "My beautiful wife finally decided to join us," Preston announced loudly, projecting the image of a loving husband. I was beginning to worry the traffic had kept her away. Monique forced a timid, subservient smile, staring up at him with wide, apologetic eyes. "I am so sorry I am late, darling," she said, her voice trembling perfectly. "I was just so overwhelmed. Simone forced me to go to that restaurant yesterday. She threatened me. I did not want any part of what she was doing. I just wanted to come back to you. I just want my family back." Preston's chest swelled with immense toxic pride. He genuinely believed every single word. His narcissism was so absolute, so blindingly vast, that he could not fathom a reality where a woman would dare to strike back against him. He believed he had successfully crushed her spirit. He leaned down, brushing his lips aggressively against her cheek, whispering directly into her ear so the politicians could not hear. "You are going to pay for the stunt you pulled yesterday," he hissed, his breath hot and threatening against her skin. "Smile for the cameras, Monique. Play your part tonight. When we get home, I am going to remind you exactly who owns you." Monique did not flinch. She placed her left hand gently on his chest, playing the role of the desperate, clinging wife. With her right hand, she reached out and grasped his right hand, twining her fingers intimately with his. "I know, Preston," she whispered, gazing up at him. "I belong to you." As she squeezed his hand, she pressed her palm firmly against his thumb. The specialized polymer tape adhered instantly, molding to the microscopic ridges of his skin. She held the grip for 3 agonizing seconds. I counted them down in her ear, watching through the scope as the biometric transfer completed. 3, 2, 1. "Pull away," I commanded. Monique gently released his hand, letting her fingers slide gracefully away. The transparent tape came with her carrying a flawless, 3-dimensional imprint of his right thumb. "I need to use the powder room," darling Monique said, taking a submissive step backward. "I will be right back to stand by your side." Preston waved her away dismissively, his attention already turning back to the mayor and the waiting photographers. "Make it quick," he ordered. Monique turned and walked away, her pace entirely measured and calm until she cleared the immediate circle of guests. I tracked her moving rapidly toward the grand staircase that led up to the VIP suites. She had the key. We were exactly 2 minutes away from breaching the terminal and bringing Preston's empire crashing down. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the crowd, gripping Monique's wrist with a vicious, bruising force. I zoomed in with my optical scanner, my blood running instantly cold. It was our mother, Vivian. Vivian's face was twisted in a mask of pure, ugly rage. She wore a diamond necklace that caught the chandelier light, a glittering collar purchased with stolen community funds. She yanked Monique forcefully out of the main hallway, dragging her roughly through a set of heavy mahogany doors and into a private, dimly lit study off the main ballroom. The perspective of the room felt violently tilted, the shadows crawling up the walls in jagged, asymmetrical lines that made the space feel incredibly claustrophobic. The heavy thud of the mahogany doors shutting entirely severed the lively music of the gala, plunging the room into a suffocating, oppressive silence. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Vivian snarled, shoving Monique backward against a heavy leather armchair. I saw you slip that piece of tape off his hand. I saw your little performance. You and Simone are planning something tonight, are you not? You are trying to sabotage this entire evening. Monique stared at our mother, her chest heaving as the adrenaline crashed through her system. Mom, you have to let me go, Monique pleaded, her voice desperate. You do not understand what Preston is doing. He is stealing $50 million tonight. He is laundering the church's money. He is a criminal. Vivian let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed terribly in the small room. Do you honestly think I care about the church funds? She snapped, stepping closer and jabbing a manicured finger at Monique's chest. Do you think your father cares? Preston is securing our future. We are finally leaving that pathetic poor neighborhood behind forever. He is buying us a massive estate in the Hamptons. He is putting your father on the city council. This is the chance of a lifetime for this family, and I will be damned if I let you and your rogue sister ruin it. Monique looked at the woman who gave birth to her, her eyes welling with a profound, shattering realization. You knew, Monique whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of the betrayal. You knew he was hitting me. You saw the bruises. You knew he was stealing from our own people, and you helped him do it. You sold me to him for a house in the Hamptons. Vivian did not even have the decency to look ashamed. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of maternal love. I survived living in the dirt for 30 years, Vivian said, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. I scrubbed floors. I wore cheap clothes. I am never going back to that life. Preston provides for us. He is a powerful man. Powerful men have flaws, Monique. You are supposed to be a good wife and endure them. Instead, you are acting like a traitor. Vivian pulled her phone from her glittering clutch. I am calling Preston's personal security team right now, she threatened. I am going to tell them you are having a severe psychiatric breakdown. They will drag you out the back door, throw you in a private hospital hold, and you will never see your son again. Do not test me, Monique. I will end you to protect this family. Vivian raised the phone, her thumb moving to dial the security detail. She never made the call. I stepped silently out from behind the heavy velvet drapes covering the study windows. I moved with the absolute lethal silence of a ghost. Vivian did not hear my footsteps. She did not sense the shift in the air. She was completely consumed by her own toxic greed. I stepped directly behind her, raising my right hand. I held a small pressurized auto-injector loaded with a specialized fast-acting military-grade sedative. It was a precise chemical compound used in covert extractions to neutralize a target instantly without causing permanent physical damage. I pressed the injector firmly against the side of her neck and pulled the trigger. Vivian gasped a sharp, sudden intake of breath as the mechanism hissed. Her eyes went incredibly wide, her phone slipping from her fingers and bouncing softly on the plush carpet. She turned her head, her gaze locking onto my face. She tried to speak, tried to scream for the guards, but the sedative was already crashing through her bloodstream, completely shutting down her central nervous system in a matter of seconds. Her knees buckled, her eyes rolling back as all the tension left her body. I caught her under the arms, lowering her dead weight gently onto the heavy leather sofa so she would not strike her head on the coffee table. She slumped back against the cushions, her breathing shallow and even entirely neutralized. I looked down at the woman who had traded her daughters for blood money, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. Rest. Mother, I said, my voice cold, precise, and completely devoid of mercy. Tonight, I am going to clean up the trash you worship. I turned to Monique. She was staring at our mother's unconscious body, her hands trembling slightly, but her jaw was set in rigid stone. The last lingering illusion of our family had just been put to sleep on that sofa. There was no going back. Do you have the print? I asked, adjusting the cuffs of my suit jacket. Monique raised her right hand, revealing the transparent polymer tape securing Preston's biometric key. I have it, she said, her voice dropping an octave, finding a new dangerous strength. Then let us go to the VIP suite, I told her, turning toward the heavy mahogany doors. It is time to make Preston a very poor man. I left the heavy mahogany doors of the private study completely sealed, leaving our unconscious mother slumped lifelessly against the expensive leather sofa. She would sleep deeply for at least 4 hours, completely removed from the devastating reality that was about to crash down upon her highly coveted social circle. I turned my attention back to Monique. We stood in the dim, quiet service corridor, just off the main ballroom, the muffled, elegant notes of a live string quartet vibrating through the walls. Monique held her right hand out, her fingers trembling slightly, as she presented the transparent military-grade polymer tape. Pressed perfectly against the adhesive surface was the flawless, three-dimensional imprint of Preston's right thumb. I took the tape from her hands with absolute surgical care. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and withdrew a specialized biometric digitizer. It was a compact matte black device roughly the size of a smartphone, originally designed by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency for covert field extractions. I placed the polymer tape flat onto the glass scanning plate. The device hummed to life instantly, casting a harsh, aggressive green laser across the transparent surface. The laser swept back and forth, mapping the microscopic ridges, the sweat pores, and the exact physical depth of Preston's arrogant fingerprint. Within seconds, the device converted the physical imprint into a complex, highly encrypted digital algorithm. I connected a secure titanium-encased USB drive to the port at the base of the scanner, transferring the raw biometric data directly onto the drive. "Go back out there," I instructed Monique, my voice low and completely steady. "Grab a glass of champagne, stand near the edge of the crowd, look absolutely terrified and submissive, exactly the way he expects you to look. Let his massive, blinding ego do all the heavy lifting." Monique took a deep, shuddering breath, smoothing down the fabric of her stunning emerald green evening gown. She nodded once, her eyes hardening with a newfound dangerous resolve, and walked back out into the glittering lights of the grand ballroom. I turned in the opposite direction, slipping silently into the labyrinth of restricted service corridors. The opulent gala was taking place on the ground floor, but the central nervous system of the entire building, the master audio and visual control room, was perched high on the mezzanine level, directly overlooking the main stage. I navigated the back hallways with the fluid, silent grace of a ghost. I bypassed two roaming security guards by simply stepping into the heavy shadows of a linen closet, waiting for their heavy, clumsy footsteps to fade down the hall. They were private corporate security, completely oblivious to the fact that their perimeter had just been fatally breached. I reached a reinforced steel door, marked with a bold red sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." I did not even break my stride. I pulled a customized electromagnetic bypass tool from my belt, pressing the magnetic node directly against the digital keypad. A short, silent burst of localized frequency scrambled the internal circuitry, and the heavy electronic deadbolt clicked open with a satisfying mechanical thud. I slipped inside the control room, locking the reinforced door firmly behind me. The atmosphere inside the control room was instantly suffocating. The air was incredibly dry and freezing cold to keep the massive server racks from overheating. The room was entirely asymmetrical, a cramped, jagged space filled with towering banks of blinking servers, complex mixing boards, and a massive wall of high-definition monitors displaying every conceivable angle of the ballroom below. The darkness of the room felt oppressive, the only illumination coming from the harsh, cold blue light of the monitors reflecting off my face. I stepped up to the primary master terminal. This centralized system controlled the massive state-of-the-art LED presentation screens positioned directly behind the main stage in the ballroom. I pulled my customized tactical tablet from my jacket and ran a direct hardline cable into the hotel's network backbone. I was not just hacking their visual displays, I was bridging a direct connection between the public AV system and the highly secured localized Wi-Fi network Preston was utilizing for his offshore financial transfers. I plugged the matte black USB drive containing his digitized fingerprint into the primary server port. The system instantly detected the foreign intrusion. A prompt appeared on the center monitor, demanding top-tier biometric authorization to access the encrypted financial routing software. I executed the spoofing protocol, feeding the digitized algorithm of Preston's thumbprint directly into the security gate. For a fraction of a second, the screen glowed a tranquil, accepting green. But Preston was incredibly paranoid. He had anticipated that someone might eventually try to bypass his localized network. He had not just relied on standard expensive corporate security. The serene green screen violently flashed to a blinding aggressive crimson red. A blaring localized warning siren pulsed sharply through my wireless earpiece. A massive digital counter suddenly materialized in the absolute center of the monitor, burning in bright, white, unforgiving numbers. 30 seconds. Preston had embedded a highly volatile, deeply hostile counter-malware protocol into the core of his financial system. It was a digital tripwire. If the secondary decryption sequence was not perfectly matched, within 30 seconds, the malware would violently execute. It would incinerate every single file on the server permanently, wipe the offshore routing numbers, and trigger a massive building-wide lockdown that would seal all the doors and summon local law enforcement. 28 seconds. I did not panic. I did not even flinch. My heart rate remained at a steady clinical rhythm. As the hostile code rapidly scrolled across my secondary monitor, I recognized the brutal, jagged architecture immediately. It was a cheap commercial derivative of a hostile state-sponsored firewall I had personally dismantled during a highly classified black operation in Eastern Europe 6 years ago. Preston thought he had purchased the ultimate digital shield. He had absolutely no idea he was matching wits with the woman who wrote the textbook on modern cyber warfare. 24 seconds. My fingers hit the mechanical keyboard, moving with absolute blinding speed. The rapid, rhythmic, aggressive clatter of the keys was the only sound in the freezing, claustrophobic room. I opened 3 separate command windows, simultaneously executing highly complex override protocols designed to trap the advancing malware in a localized digital loop. 20 seconds. The blue and red light of the monitors reflected intensely in my eyes. I was sweating slightly, the adrenaline spiking sharply in my veins, a familiar welcome friend. I typed relentlessly, my muscle memory taking over completely. I treated the digital battlefield with the exact same lethal precision, absolute ruthlessness, and zero hesitation that I used in physical close-quarters combat. 15 seconds. The counter-malware actively mutated, shifting its algorithms violently as it attempted to bypass my secondary firewalls and reach the core data drive. It was aggressive, but it was incredibly sloppy. 10 seconds. I successfully isolated the root command, identifying the exact specific IP address Preston had utilized to arm the digital trap. I wrote a rapid, aggressive counterscript, an offensive digital payload designed to flood his malware with a massive, overwhelming data surge. 5 seconds. The white numbers on the screen flashed dangerously. 4, 3. With exactly 2 seconds left on the digital clock, I slammed my index finger down on the main execution key. The aggressive, blinding crimson red instantly vanished from all the monitors. The room was plunged back into a smooth, tranquil blue. A small, unassuming notification appeared in the bottom right corner of the primary screen: network access granted. Countermeasure neutralized. I let out a slow, steady breath, rolling my shoulders to release the built-up tension. I was entirely inside his system. I had absolute unrestricted access to every single hidden bank account, every offshore shell company, and every stolen dollar. I quickly routed the localized data feed from Preston's secure network directly to the massive LED presentation screens positioned behind the main stage in the ballroom below. I looked up at the wall of security monitors, zooming in on the live feed of the gala. Down on the glittering floor, the string quartet had ceased playing. The crowd of wealthy elites, local politicians, and influential socialites had gone completely silent, their attention captivated by the grand stage. Preston was stepping up to the crystal podium, bathing in the warm golden glow of the spotlights. He adjusted the lapels of his custom velvet dinner jacket and smiled warmly, looking directly at the mayor, who was sitting in the front row. Preston held a sleek silver tablet in his left hand. He looked incredibly powerful, a man entirely in control of his universe. He was currently delivering a passionate, utterly hypocritical speech about the importance of community charity, about lifting up the less fortunate, and about the deep, unwavering moral values of the Sterling family name. He believed he was seconds away from pressing a button on that tablet that would supposedly initiate a multi-million-dollar charitable donation for the cameras. In reality, that button was programmed to wire $50 million of stolen church funds directly into an untraceable offshore crypto account in the Cayman Islands. I watched him raise his right hand, gesturing grandly to the crowd as he prepared to deliver his final arrogant lie to the wealthy elite. I rested my index finger lightly over the master enter key on my terminal, fully linking the giant projector screens in the ballroom directly to the raw, unedited financial logs currently loading on his personal tablet. "It's time to change the channel, you piece of trash," I whispered into the silence of the control room. "Time to change the channel, you piece of trash." Looking down through the tinted soundproof glass of the control room, I had a godlike view of the impending slaughter. The ballroom was a sea of glittering jewels and tailored tuxedos. "The Black Heritage Fund is more than a charity." Preston's voice boomed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system, oozing with a practiced, nauseating sincerity. "It is a promise to our elders, to our children, and to the very soul of Atlanta. Together, we are not just preserving brick and mortar, we are preserving our legacy." He raised the silver tablet high in the air. The crowd erupted into rapturous applause. The mayor, sitting in the front row, nodded in profound approval. My father, Bishop Sterling, stood just 2 feet behind Preston, wearing his finest clerical collar, his hands clasped in pious satisfaction. Preston looked down at the tablet, his thumb hovering over the biometric sensor. He believed he was initiating the stealth protocol to drain the church trusts and wire $50 million directly into his untraceable Cayman account. I pressed the enter key with a sharp, definitive strike. The transition was instantaneous and violent. The massive 40-foot LED screens dominating the wall behind the stage flickered. The heartwarming, high-production promotional video of smiling children and restored historical buildings vanished entirely. In its place, the sterile, unforgiving glare of Preston's master offline ledger illuminated the entire ballroom. Rows of offshore routing numbers scrolled down the screen in massive, glaring red text. The header of the document was unmistakable. It read, "Sterling Trust Liquidation Cayman Routing." Beside the scrolling numbers, my custom code pulled up Preston's private encrypted text messages, magnifying them to 10 feet tall, so even the guests in the very back row could read every single word. "These gullible idiots are practically handing me the deeds. The bishop has them completely brainwashed. Transfer the south side blocks tomorrow. I want the land cleared by the end of the month." The applause died a sudden, unnatural death. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Hundreds of the city's most influential investors, politicians, and socialites stared at the screens in profound, mounting horror. I was not finished. Financial ruin was a fitting punishment for his greed, but it was not nearly enough for what he had done to my sister. My fingers danced across the keyboard, executing the final, most devastating payload. The right half of the massive LED screen shifted. Crystal clear, high-definition security footage filled the display. It was the hidden camera footage I had secretly extracted from Preston's own home security network. The entire ballroom watched in breathless, paralyzed silence as the 10-foot-tall image of Preston backhanded Monique violently across the face, sending her crashing into a marble countertop. The audio from the video fed directly into the ballroom's main speakers, capturing the sickening crack of the impact and Preston's vicious, snarling voice threatening to kill her if she ever questioned his finances again. Preston froze, his arms still awkwardly raised, holding the tablet. He turned his head slowly, looking over his shoulder at the colossal screen projecting his absolute monstrosity to the world. The blood drained from his face so fast, he looked like a corpse. His confident philanthropic mask disintegrated, leaving only the terrified, pathetic coward underneath. He frantically jabbed his thumb against his tablet, desperately trying to trigger the kill switch, but my terminal had completely locked him out of his own system. His device was nothing more than an expensive, useless piece of glass. Beside him, Bishop Sterling stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. His eyes bulged as his own name appeared on the screen, detailing his specific cut of the laundered funds. The holy man of the community was exposed as the architect of its destruction. The mayor, who had just been applauding them both, shot out of his front row seat, his face purple with rage, shouting at his aides to get him out of the blast radius. The ballroom erupted into absolute, unmitigated chaos. Wealthy investors began shouting furiously, surging toward the stage, and demanding answers. Women covered their mouths in horror at the visceral footage of Monique's abuse playing on a loop. The donors realized in real time that they were not attending a charity gala. They were funding a violent predator's escape plan. "Turn it off!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. His perfectly tailored velvet jacket seemed too large for his suddenly shrinking frame. He dropped the useless tablet, waving his arms wildly at the control booth where I sat hidden in the dark. "Cut the power. Security. Get up there and cut the power right now." I leaned back in the cold leather chair of the control room, watching the destruction of his empire unfold with clinical satisfaction. He was a cornered rat, stripped of his money, his power, and his reputation in less than 60 seconds. He had nowhere to run. His hired muscle was currently lying unconscious, zip-tied to the floor of my living room across town. "Security!" Preston shrieked again, his voice echoing over the angry roar of the crowd. He scrambled toward the edge of the stage, desperately looking for an exit route. Suddenly, the massive brass-handled double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst violently open. They hit the walls with a thunderous crash that instantly silenced the screaming investors. Preston stopped dead in his tracks. It was not the hotel security team responding to his frantic orders. Over 36 federal agents wearing tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI, poured into the grand ballroom. The tactical boots hitting the polished marble floor echoed like 100 heavy gavels striking wood. The lead agent, a massive man holding a megaphone, bellowed for everyone in the room to freeze and keep their hands clearly visible. The elegant string quartet had instantly abandoned their instruments, and the only music left was the chaotic, jarring symphony of shattering champagne flutes and panicked, high-pitched screams. The wealthy elite of Atlanta people who had spent their entirely privileged lives completely insulated from any real consequences were shoving each other aside in a desperate, undignified scramble to distance themselves from the stage. I stepped out of the freezing server control room, pulling the heavy reinforced door shut until the magnetic lock clicked securely into place. I walked to the edge of the mezzanine balcony and looked down at the absolute destruction of Preston's fabricated kingdom. It was a masterpiece of digital warfare translated into physical reality. I began my descent down the grand sweeping marble staircase that curved toward the ballroom floor. I moved with the slow, deliberate, unhurried pacing of an apex predator casually inspecting a successfully triggered trap. The panicked crowd of socialites and corrupt investors naturally parted from me as I walked. They took one look at my face, cold, composed, and completely unbothered by the federal raid happening around us, and they instinctively backed away, clearing a wide path. Across the room, standing completely still amid the swirling chaos, I caught sight of Monique. Her stunning emerald green gown was untouched by the panic. Her posture was rigidly straight, her chin held high. Our eyes met across the ballroom, and a profound, silent communication passed between us. She was free. The monster who had terrorized her, the man who believed he owned her very existence, was currently bleeding onto a stage in front of the entire city. 4 heavily armed federal agents had already swarmed the main presentation stage. Preston had tried to run a pathetic, reflexive display of cowardice, but his expensive velvet dinner jacket offered absolutely zero protection against the brute force of a highly trained tactical team. An agent grabbed him by the shoulder, spinning him violently around, before driving him face first into the crystal presentation podium. The podium shattered into 1,000 glittering, jagged pieces as Preston crashed hard onto the polished wood of the stage. 2 more agents instantly pinned his arms aggressively behind his back, securing his wrists with heavy industrial plastic zip ties. I reached the base of the stage just as the agents hauled Preston roughly to his knees. His custom velvet suit was completely ruined, torn at the shoulder seam, and heavily dusted with shards of broken crystal. A thin, dark trail of blood leaked from his split lower lip. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving with exertion and pure panic. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching desperately for a sympathetic face and ally a way out. Instead, his eyes locked onto me. I was standing calmly at the foot of the stairs, my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my tailored charcoal suit. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a freight train. He looked up at the massive LED screen still scrolling his offshore accounts and his private abusive text messages, and then he looked back at my unbothered expression. He connected the massive, impossible data breach directly to my sudden appearance. His shock instantly mutated into a rabid, venomous, feral hatred. "It was you!" Preston roared, his voice cracking with a desperate, hysterical rage as he struggled uselessly against the federal agents anchoring him to the floor. He thrashed his shoulders, spitting a small amount of blood onto the polished wood. "You did this. You are nothing. You are just a lowly black woman. I will kill you for this. I will ruin you." I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not break eye contact. True power never needs to shout. I walked slowly up the short flight of stairs to the stage, my leather shoes crunching softly over the broken crystal of his podium. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from where he was kneeling in the absolute ruins of his fake charitable empire. I slowly crouched down, resting my forearms on my knees, bringing my face perfectly level with his. I stared directly into his bloodshot, terrified, hateful eyes. "The only thing lowly here is your greed, Preston," I said, my voice smooth, precise, and cutting like a surgical blade. "You thought you could buy our city, steal our generational legacy, and physically abuse my sister without a single consequence because you believed your wealth made you an untouchable god. You thought you were the smartest person in the room. You were wrong. You are just a fragile, arrogant little man with a stolen bank account." Preston bared his teeth, straining against the zip ties, but I leaned in just a fraction closer, ensuring my next words would shatter whatever tiny shred of hope he had left. "And speaking of your accounts, you should know exactly what I did while you were giving your little speech." I continued, my tone lowering to a deadly whisper. "I did not just freeze your domestic assets. I actively rerouted the entire $50 million transfer you tried to initiate. I bypassed your Cayman routing numbers and sent every single penny directly into a federal treasury seizure fund using an irrevocable military-grade digital lock. I handed the FBI the decryption key along with your entire server log, every offshore shell company, every hidden crypto wallet, every single dollar you have ever stolen from my people is permanently gone." Preston stopped struggling. The ragged breath hitched violently in his throat. "You are completely bankrupt, Preston," I stated, allowing a cold, victorious smile to finally touch the corners of my mouth. "You do not even have enough money left to hire a public defender." The feral rage in his eyes dissolved instantly, replaced by an absolute soul-crushing despair. He sagged heavily against the tactical agents, the reality of his total, inescapable annihilation finally sinking in. He was going to federal prison for a very long time, and he was going there completely broke. The agents hoisted him to his feet without an ounce of gentleness, dragging his limp, defeated, silent body off the stage and toward the flashing blue and red emergency lights waiting outside the main entrance. I stood up, brushing a speck of dust from my jacket, watching him disappear into the custody of the federal government. As Preston was hauled out of the ballroom, the chaotic crowd parted once again. My father, Bishop Sterling, was frantically pushing his way through the panicked investors and confused socialites. He was sweating profusely, his face pale, terrified, and slick under the harsh glare of the ballroom chandeliers. He was desperately adjusting his white clerical collar, trying frantically to project an aura of divine innocence and righteous outrage while surrounded by heavily armed federal agents. He zeroed in on the lead FBI agent, who was currently collecting Preston's discarded, useless silver tablet from the stage floor and placing it into an evidence bag. "Agent, please, you have to listen to me. You have to understand." My father begged, his voice trembling loudly with manufactured shock and profound betrayal. He pressed a hand dramatically to his chest, playing the role of the wounded, naive spiritual leader to absolute perfection. "I knew absolutely nothing about this white man, this devil in a tailored suit. He deceived our entire church. He came to us offering financial salvation for our community, lands, and he completely manipulated my congregation. He tricked me. We are victims here. I am a victim of his fraud. The lead agent looked at my father with a blank, entirely unimpressed expression, clearly accustomed to the frantic, cowardly lies of cornered criminals trying to save their own skin. I slowly turned away from the exit and walked deliberately toward my father. I stopped right beside the federal agent, turning to face the man who had traded the safety of his own daughters and the homes of his congregation for a luxury estate in the Hamptons. My father froze mid-sentence, his eyes widening in genuine panic as he looked at me. The righteous facade instantly cracked, revealing the terrified, greedy fraud hiding beneath the holy collar. "Save your pathetic sermons for the federal judge bishop," I said, my voice carrying clearly echoing through the sudden heavy silence of the ballroom. My father opened his mouth to argue, to spin another web of holy lies, but I did not give him the chance. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen once, maximizing the volume to its highest setting. I did not need to argue with him. I had the ultimate, undeniable weapon. I pressed play on a highly encrypted audio file I had extracted directly from Preston's secure offline drive earlier that evening. The sound did not just play from the tiny speaker of my smartphone. Through the localized network bridge I had established in the mezzanine control room, I routed the raw audio file directly into the Grand Ballroom's massive state-of-the-art public address system. The sharp, unmistakable baritone of Bishop Sterling echoed from the towering speakers, vibrating through the crystal chandeliers and bouncing off the gilded ceiling. There was no holy inflection in his voice. There was no practiced cadence of a Sunday morning sermon. There was only the cold, calculating, predatory tone of a man negotiating the price of his own congregation. "Just take the land from those slums?" "Preston," my father's recorded voice boomed through the ballroom, sounding impossibly loud in the stunned silence. "They trust me blindly. They will sign whatever development waivers I put in front of them if I tell them it is God's will. You clear out those rotting blocks by the end of the quarter. Just give me a 20% cut of the liquidation and make sure it routes cleanly to the Nassau account. Do not get sloppy." The audio file clicked off, plunging the massive room into a heavy, suffocating quiet. The silence was absolute, a profound collective paralysis that gripped every single person in the space. If the ballroom had been chaotic when Preston's financial crimes were exposed, it now descended into a state of pure, unadulterated shock. Preston was a known corporate shark, a man expected to be ruthless. But Bishop Sterling was a pillar of the community. He was the moral compass of Atlanta, the man who baptized their children, officiated their weddings, and preached salvation every Sunday. From my position on the stage, the entire perspective of the room seemed to tilt sharply. The world skewed into a harsh, jagged, unsettling angle, perfectly framing my father's catastrophic collapse. The camera of his life was zooming in close, capturing the exact excruciating moment his golden pedestal shattered into dust. His face, usually a mask of divine, untouchable authority, simply fell apart. The warm, golden hue of his skin turned a sickly ashen gray. Heavy beads of terrified sweat erupted across his forehead, shining under the harsh stage lights. His hands, which had been piously clasped in front of him just moments ago, were now trembling so violently they blurred. He looked down at the crowd, his eyes wide and completely feral, searching desperately for the unwavering adoration he had fed on for 3 decades. He found none. In the second row, Deacon Washington, a man who had loyally served my father's church for 25 years, slowly lowered his head, his hands gripping his wooden cane with white knuckles. Beside him sat Sister Mary, a retired schoolteacher who routinely donated her meager pension to the Black Heritage Fund because my father told her it was her spiritual duty. She was staring at him with a look of such profound, agonizing revulsion that it seemed to physically strike him. The crowd of wealthy elites and politicians looked equally disgusted, recoiling from him, as if he were a sudden, highly contagious disease. "It is a lie!" my father suddenly shrieked, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He stumbled forward, throwing his hands out toward the crowd in a desperate, pleading gesture. "You have to listen to me. This is a trick. It is a digital fabrication. The devil is working through this woman to destroy the Lord's work." She used a computer program to fake my voice. "I am a man of God. You are a parasite," I replied, my voice cutting through his hysterical shouting with absolute icy precision. I stepped closer to him, closing the distance until I could smell the sour, pungent stench of his fear. "You signed the zoning waivers on November 14th. You authorized the transfer of the Southside Community Center on December 2nd. And the Nassau account you mentioned in that recording matches the exact offshore routing number scrolling on the screen behind you right now. The account is registered to a shell company in your name. You sold out your own people to line your pockets, and you used God as a shield to do it." My father backed away from me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He looked wildly at the federal agents securing the perimeter of the stage, his chest heaving. "Please," he begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic, trembling whisper. I did not know what Preston was doing. I was confused. I was misled. The lead FBI agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with slate-gray eyes, stepped squarely onto the stage. He did not look at my father with respect or deference. He looked at him the exact same way he looked at the cartel bosses and corrupt politicians he arrested for a living. "Bishop Sterling," the agent said, his voice a flat, uncompromising rumble. "You are completely out of lies." The agent snapped his fingers, signaling two tactical officers standing by the shattered podium. They moved with terrifying practice speed. Before my father could take another backward step, the agents flanked him, grabbing his arms with crushing force. They spun him around roughly, shoving his chest against the only remaining intact section of the stage wall. "No, no, you cannot do this to me!" My father sobbed, his voice pitching into a high, undignified wail as he struggled weakly against the heavily armed men. "I am a bishop. I am a leader of this city." "You are under arrest," the lead agent announced, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He stepped forward, grabbing my father's wrists and wrenching them behind his back. The sharp mechanical click of the locking mechanism echoed sharply through the room. "You are being charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive tax evasion, and violating the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it immediately." My father slumped against the wall, his knees giving out entirely. The agents had to physically hold him upright by his armpits. His immaculate, expensive, holy vestments were crumpled and stained with sweat, completely at odds with the cold, heavy steel binding his wrists. The great Bishop Sterling was weeping openly, a broken, greedy old man finally facing the devastating reality of his own sins. I stood perfectly still, watching the authorities strip him of his freedom. I felt no joy, no sadness, no pity. I felt only the clean, sterile satisfaction of a deeply infected wound finally being sterilized. Suddenly, a chaotic commotion erupted near the back of the ballroom. The heavy mahogany double doors leading from the private upstairs suites burst open with a violent crash. Standing in the threshold was my mother, Vivian. She looked entirely unhinged. The heavy sedative I had slipped into her tea earlier in the evening had clearly begun to wear off, likely disrupted by the blaring sirens and the echoing shouts vibrating through the hotel walls. She was swaying slightly on her feet. Her normally flawless hair was flattened on one side, her expensive silk evening gown was severely wrinkled, and her makeup was slightly smudged around her eyes. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself, her eyes wide and disoriented, as she tried to process the surreal nightmare playing out on the ballroom floor. She saw the shattered glass. She saw Preston being dragged out by federal authorities in the distance. And then her eyes locked onto the stage. She saw her husband, the source of her immense wealth, her unearned social status, and her entire identity pinned against a wall, in handcuffs, weeping like a child. "Robert," my mother screamed. The sound was a raw, primal shriek of pure denial. She pushed away from the doorframe, stumbling blindly into the ballroom. She shoved past two bewildered investors, her high heels catching on the carpet as she sprinted frantically toward the stage. Tears were streaming rapidly down her face, ruining her carefully applied mascara. The chemical fog of the sedative was completely burned away by the sheer adrenaline of her collapsing reality. "Robert, what are they doing to you?" she wailed, trying to claw her way up the stage stairs before an FBI agent firmly blocked her path, holding a hand up to keep her back. "Let him go. He is a good man. He has done nothing wrong. You are making a terrible mistake, ma'am. Step back immediately," the agent ordered, his voice brooking no argument. My mother ignored him, her frantic, panicked gaze sweeping the stage until it landed directly on me. I was standing tall, my hands still in my pockets, my expression a wall of impenetrable ice. Her eyes darted from my face to the massive LED screen projecting my father's crimes, and the realization hit her instantly. She knew I possessed the skills. She knew I had the motive. She understood that I was the architect of this absolute destruction. Her panic mutated into a blinding, venomous hatred. The toxic enabling that had defined her entire life, the fierce protection of her corrupt husband at the expense of her own daughters, flared up in a desperate, violent surge. She lunged around the federal agent, scrambling up the last two stairs with surprising speed. Her face was contorted in a mask of pure rage. She raised her right hand high into the air, her fingers curled tight, aiming a vicious full-force slap directly at my face. I did not step back. I did not flinch. My left hand snapped up with the blinding, reflexive speed of a coiled strike. I caught her wrist in midair less than 2 inches from my cheek. My grip was like a steel vise. The momentum of her swing crashed into my rigid arm, stopping her completely dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened in profound shock, staring at my hand locked around her wrist. She tried to yank her arm back, struggling against my hold, but she could not move an inch. The physical reality of the situation finally mirrored the emotional truth. She had absolutely no power over me anymore. I was not the scared, rejected child she could verbally and emotionally abuse. I was a force of nature, and she was nothing. I squeezed her wrist just hard enough to make her gasp in pain, leaning in so only she could hear the absolute finality in my voice over the chaotic noise of the room. "You always told me I was the ultimate disgrace of this family. Mother?" I whispered, my voice dripping with a lethal, icy calm as I stared directly into her terrified eyes. "You told me my independence was a curse and that I would never amount to anything compared to the great Bishop Sterling." I released her wrist with a sharp, dismissive shove, forcing her to stumble backward a step. She clutched her arm to her chest heaving, staring at me as if I were a terrifying stranger. "Well, look around you," I said, gesturing broadly to the ruined stage, the federal agents, and her weeping, handcuffed husband. "Today, I decided to clean up that disgrace myself." My mother stumbled backward, clutching her wrist as if it had been severely burned. Her eyes, usually so full of practiced, haughty condescension, were completely hollow, dilated with a raw, unadulterated terror. She looked at me not as her daughter, but as an absolute stranger, a terrifying force of nature that had just fundamentally dismantled her entire universe. She opened her mouth to speak, to hurl another venomous insult, or demand my obedience, but the words died in her throat. She had nothing left. I stepped around her paralyzed form, not affording her a single backward glance, and walked deliberately out of the grand ballroom. The cool, crisp Atlanta night air hit my face as I pushed through the shattered glass of the main entrance doors. The entire front courtyard of the luxury hotel had been completely locked down, transformed into a sprawling, chaotic command center. The aggressive, synchronized strobe of red and blue emergency lights painted the pristine marble pillars and the terrified faces of the fleeing elite in harsh, flashing colors. The air was thick with the squawk of police radios, the barking orders of federal marshals, and the frantic, undignified sobbing of the city's most powerful people, realizing they were about to be thoroughly audited. I walked slowly down the wide concrete steps, my eyes tracking the mesmerizing, satisfying flow of justice. To my left, I watched my father, Bishop Sterling, being shoved roughly into the back of an armored federal transport vehicle. His customized, pure white clerical vestments were stained with sweat and dirt. He was weeping openly, pleading with an impassive, stone-faced agent about his political connections and his community standing. The agent simply placed a heavy hand on my father's head, forcing him down into the cramped, dark back seat, and slammed the heavy metal door shut, instantly silencing his pathetic, hypocritical begging. To my right, Preston was currently fighting a losing battle against three heavily armed tactical agents. He was refusing to walk, dragging his expensive Italian leather shoes across the pavement, twisting his shoulders violently against the industrial zip ties cutting into his wrists. He was completely stripped of his arrogant, polished veneer. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a feral, cornered predator desperately thrashing against a trap he could not escape. "Wait!" Preston suddenly screamed, digging his heels into the asphalt and throwing his weight backward. His wild, bloodshot eyes were fixed on a sleek black, unmarked SUV parked directly adjacent to the mobile command unit. The heavy passenger door of the SUV swung open. Two federal agents stepped out first, establishing a secure perimeter, followed immediately by a tall, slender woman wrapped tightly in a beige trench coat. It was Valerie, Preston's young blonde, fiercely loyal mistress. Preston stopped struggling entirely, his mouth falling open in a display of profound, staggering relief. He thought he was looking at his salvation. He believed that Valerie, the woman he showered with stolen money and luxury gifts, was there to provide an alibi to scream his innocence to the authorities. Valerie Preston shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate manic hope. "Tell them! Tell these idiots they have the wrong man. Tell them the offshore accounts were hacked. Call my private legal team right now." Valerie did not move to help him. She did not cry. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She stood perfectly still behind the protective wall of federal agents, looking at Preston with an expression of absolute freezing disgust. She pulled her trench coat tighter around her shoulders and gave a single definitive shake of her head. "I gave them the hardware keys," Preston Valerie said, her voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the raid. "I gave them everything. The secondary ledgers, the physical biometric drives you kept in the safe, and the recorded phone calls. It is over." Preston's face went completely slack, his brain struggling violently to process the magnitude of the betrayal. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, his voice dropping an octave raw with shock. "You love me. I gave you everything." "You gave me a customized federal prison sentence," I stated, stepping off the final concrete stair and walking directly into Preston's line of sight. He whipped his head toward me, his eyes burning with a fresh homicidal fury. "I did not just spend the last 48 hours dismantling your digital firewalls," I explained, keeping my tone conversational, clinical, and completely devoid of empathy. "I also took the liberty of looking into the foundational architecture of your offshore holding companies. You thought you were incredibly clever registering the primary Cayman accounts under an anonymous corporate proxy. But you needed a physical, verifiable signature for the international transfer thresholds. You did not use your own name. You did not use your lawyers. You used Valerie's." Preston's breath hitched his chest, freezing as I laid his absolute cowardice bare for everyone to see. "I paid Valerie a very quiet, very educational visit 2 nights ago at the luxury condo you bought her," I continued, my voice echoing coldly in the damp night air. "I brought her a comprehensive printed dossier containing every single fraudulent document bearing her forged electronic signature. I showed her exactly how you had perfectly positioned her as the ultimate disposable human shield. If the federal authorities ever breached your accounts, the digital paper trail would bypass you entirely and point directly to her. She was facing 30 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering, all while you planned to walk away completely clean." I looked over at Valerie. She offered me a brief, sharp nod of solidarity. She was entirely immune from prosecution, having traded her physical access to Preston's safe for a comprehensive federal witness protection agreement. "I simply offered her a choice, Preston," I said, turning my gaze back to the ruined man bleeding onto the pavement. "She could take the fall for a predator who planned to throw her to the wolves, or she could hand me the physical decryption keys and walk away with a clean slate. Survival is a very powerful motivator. You should have known that. You spent your entire life preying on the desperate." The reality of his total, inescapable annihilation finally crashed down upon him. The money was gone. The reputation was destroyed. His ultimate scapegoat had handed the weapon directly to the executioner. "You lying, treacherous bitch!" Preston roared, a guttural, animalistic sound of pure, unadulterated hatred. He lunged violently forward, trying to break free from the agents to reach Valerie, but the tactical officers slammed him ruthlessly downward, driving his knees hard into the unforgiving concrete. He twisted his head, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the pavement, his eyes locking onto me with a terrifying homicidal madness. "I will kill you. I will spend every single dollar I have left to have you gutted. You are dead. Both of you. You are dead. You do not have any dollars left," I reminded him softly. "Enjoy the public defender." The lead agent did not tolerate another second of the outburst. He grabbed the back of Preston's ruined velvet jacket and shoved his head forcefully downward, throwing him brutally into the back of the armored police cruiser. The heavy metal door slammed shut with a deafening final thud, instantly cutting off Preston's muffled, hysterical screaming. I stood in the center of the flashing lights, crossing my arms over my chest, watching the convoy of federal vehicles pull away from the curb. They disappeared down the long, winding driveway of the luxury hotel, taking the monsters of my past with them. A few yards away, I saw my mother sitting on the edge of the concrete sidewalk. She was weeping into her hands, completely alone. Several women from her exclusive country club women she had spent decades actively courting and trying to impress, walked briskly past her, pulling their expensive coats tight and deliberately averting their eyes. The social isolation was immediate and absolute. She had built her entire identity on the illusion of power and prestige, and without it she was entirely invisible. I looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing, and turned my back. A soft, hesitant footstep sounded behind me. I turned to see Monique walking slowly down the stairs. She had grabbed a heavy wool coat from the coat check, wrapping it tightly over her emerald green evening gown. She was shivering slightly, though the night air was not particularly cold. It was the biological aftermath of a massive adrenaline crash. The physical release of years of sustained, suffocating terror, finally leaving her body. She walked up to me, her eyes tracking the empty driveway where Preston's transport vehicle had vanished. "Is he really gone?" Monique asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow summon him back. "He is gone," I confirmed, my voice softening for the first time that evening. "He is bankrupt, he is exposed, and he is facing decades in federal lockup. He can never, ever hurt you again." Monique stared at me, her eyes filling with thick, heavy tears. She did not say a word. She simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms around my neck, burying her face into my shoulder. I caught her, wrapping my arms tightly around her back, holding her as she finally let out a long, shuddering, broken sob of absolute relief. We stood there together, two women finally free, holding each other securely in the smoldering, chaotic ruins of a fake predatory empire. I had burned it all to the ground exactly as I promised I would. By dawn, the world had fundamentally changed. The fallout was instantaneous, brutal, and completely unprecedented. The financial logs and the security footage I had forced onto the gala screens were leaked simultaneously to every major national news outlet. The story erupted across the country like wildfire. The morning broadcasts were completely dominated by the staggering collapse of the Sterling legacy. Chyrons scrolled across millions of television screens in bold, relentless letters. Prominent Atlanta bishop arrested in massive real estate fraud. Billionaire tech investor exposed in brutal domestic abuse and embezzlement scandal. The Black Heritage Fund was immediately frozen by federal regulators. The board of directors at my father's megachurch, terrified of being implicated in the RICO charges, immediately voted to strip him of his title and sever all ties, cooperating fully and publicly with the federal investigation. The properties Preston had stolen were seized by the state, pending a massive restitution effort to return the deeds to the rightful community owners. The Sterling family, once considered untouchable royalty, was officially irreversibly destroyed. The harsh, aggressive glare of red and blue police lights slowly faded from my memory, bleeding seamlessly into the warm, golden afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the newly renovated Southside Community Center. 6 months had passed since the night the Sterling Empire crumbled into dust, and the world looked entirely different. I stood near the entrance, sipping a cup of black coffee, as a sleek flat-screen television mounted on the wall played the local midday news. The anchor's voice was crisp and professional, delivering the final definitive blow to the men who thought they owned our city. Preston had just been officially sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for massive financial fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. My father stripped of his clerical collar, and his dignity had accepted a plea deal. He received a 10-year sentence in a federal facility, effectively ensuring he would spend his twilight years wearing a government-issued jumpsuit. The broadcast flashed a brief, unflattering photo of my mother leaving the courthouse. Vivian had been summarily evicted from the sprawling Buckhead mansion, which the federal government seized to pay off my father's exorbitant legal penalties. Stripped of her unearned wealth and completely shunned by the elite social circles she had worshipped, she was now living in a cramped two-bedroom apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. She was surviving on a meager court-mandated stipend, completely isolated, a forgotten ghost haunting a life she used to mock. I turned my attention away from the television and looked across the bustling community center. Monique was standing at the front of the room addressing a crowd of local business owners and volunteers. She was absolutely radiant. The terrified, submissive woman I had found trembling in a gilded cage was entirely gone. Her divorce from Preston had been finalized with brutal efficiency, granting her absolute full custody of her children. Furthermore, the city had legally appointed her as the new executive director of the fully restored Black Heritage Fund. The $50 million I had recovered from Preston's offshore accounts had been completely returned to the community trusts. Monique was now wielding that power to rebuild the exact neighborhoods our father had tried to sell off. She commanded the room with a natural, fierce grace, a true leader standing firmly on the ashes of her abuser's fake empire. As for me, my phone had been ringing constantly since the gala. My high-profile unilateral dismantling of Preston's encrypted financial network had caught the attention of every major tech corporation in Silicon Valley. I received highly lucrative job offers from executives desperate to harness my specific brand of digital warfare. I turned them all down. Instead, I pooled my accumulated military savings with the substantial federal bounty the government paid me for recovering the stolen charitable funds. I bought a sleek commercial office space downtown and launched my own independent cybersecurity firm. I was the sole CEO, and I had exactly one strict hiring policy. I exclusively recruited brilliant, historically overlooked women of color, turning them into elite digital architects capable of dismantling corrupt systems from the inside out. Monique finished her speech, the room erupting into genuine, enthusiastic applause. She caught my eye across the crowd and smiled a bright, unbroken expression of pure freedom. We had burned the toxic, abusive legacy of the Sterling family straight down to the bedrock, and we had built our own magnificent kingdom right on top of it. I stand in the exact same living room where this entire nightmare originally began. The warm evening light filters through the glass as I take a slow, deliberate sip from a crystal glass of deep red wine. A quiet, entirely genuine smile finally rests on my face. Just a few days ago, a thick envelope arrived in my mail. It was a letter from Vivian. It was a pathetic, rambling plea begging me to visit my father in the federal penitentiary and demanding that I start sending her a monthly stipend to ease her new cramped reality. I did not write a letter back. I simply took a crisp $500 bill, the exact amount Preston had so arrogantly thrown in my face on the day of the gala, and slipped it into her return envelope. I included a single handwritten note on a piece of heavy cardstock, "Try Uber." Society constantly conditions women to endure silent suffering, to swallow our pride and sacrifice our own sanity just to maintain the fragile illusion of family peace. They look at the quiet ones, the women who do not boast or scream for attention, and mistakenly assume we are the easiest targets to bully and control. But they forget one fundamental truth. During my deployments in the military, I learned that the absolute most dangerous lethal weapons on the battlefield are always the ones equipped with silencers. Do not ever allow toxic people to use a shared bloodline as an excuse to trample your inherent worth. Sometimes, if you truly want the tree to survive and flourish, you have to pick up the axe yourself and violently sever the roots that have already rotted beneath the soil. Have you ever been forced to stand up and fight against your own family just to protect your survival? Share your story in the comments below. Do not forget to like and subscribe if you firmly believe that the sweetest revenge is living a brilliantly successful life, completely without them.